Understanding the success of movies can be hard. If we really try, the guesses we make tend to fall apart when we apply them in other areas, and then we tend to give up and assume there's too many things to know. But I found that's not actually the case. The results that movies get are in fact due to things we can understand. It may seem complex at times, but other times it's just a matter of looking at things the right way. And if you do that, you can not only understand why some movies fail and others are hits, you can even see why some movies are mild hits and others are huge hits. And I want to show that here by comparing two Quentin Tarantino movies, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and Pulp Fiction. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is a good movie experience that had a lot of talented people involved. But Pulp Fiction, by all accounts, is one of the greatest movies ever made, if you combine profit, awards, influence on the movie business, and how well it's remembered. Now, I found that most movie discussion doesn't come close to making these types of comparisons. People will give a movie a simple high rating or low rating, describe the plot if it's a movie review, and make a few comments that may sound insightful. But when you try to actually follow their logic, it falls apart. You can look yourself. Now maybe they have more knowledge about it that they're just not writing in their review, but I check that too. If you ask people about these things, I found they don't give you any more information. Instead, they tend to just get upset and act like you're trolling them. So if you really want to learn about these things, you're on your own. Or you were on your own because that's why I started this channel. Because if you do look into it with as much clear thinking as you can find what I think are some much better answers and information. That goes far beyond just a movie getting a like or dislike or 4 stars and 5 stars. So let's use our example of these two Tarantino films. Now, there's a lot to be said about Pulp Fiction. I haven't done any videos on movie dialogue yet or how rearranged timelines actually work in stories. I spent a lot of time on both of them, and especially how they work in Pulp Fiction. But for these purposes, we don't need to go into it. It's enough to say for now that those things both work, and that's a key part of it. So okay, let's start with the general idea here. Like we talked about at the very beginning of this channel, we judge movies by the total amount of good feelings we have towards them. That's really it, which seems simple, but you won't actually hear that explanation from most people who make or review movies. And on top of that, in order to really use that idea well, in my opinion, you have to know the different good feelings that people can have, and how those get triggered. The more a movie triggers those things, the more successful it will be. And a good movie triggers them a decent amount, while great or legendary movies hit the most triggers of pleasure in the highest amounts. Now, let's get into what that means with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and Pulp Fiction. Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is a good movie, but if you'll allow me to say it, it's not a great movie. I don't think anyone is comparing it to Star Wars, Citizen Kane, and so on. And there's real reasons for that. The good feelings we have come from 3 sources. The story in the movie itself, the story of what the movie has done in the real world, and the story of how the movie has affected the viewer's life. And we'll have to look at all 3. Now, it might seem a bit uncomfortable to review movies by talking about things that have nothing to do with what's actually on screen. But in a lot of ways, it's the opposite. If you actually look at the common traits of profitable films, so much of it is based on outside things that I was really excited to realize that the actual quality of a movie played any part at all. But it does. Each aspect of the movie's success, the personal story for the viewer, the real-world story, and the fictional story, is about 1/3 of the potential reaction. And for starters, there's some parts of how Once Upon a Time in Hollywood was set up that I think really hurt its impact as a story itself. Now remember, we're not saying this is a bad movie. We're going into very specific things to show what separates a good movie, like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, from a great movie like Pulp Fiction. So the primary thing with the plot of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood that I noticed while I was watching was that the movie didn't actually have a plot. It ended up having to rely on other things going on to keep the audience's interest. A plot gives you a built-in reason to keep watching. Someone trying to do something, a question you want answered, something you anticipate happening. They provide the reason for the story to go from one scene to the next, and for you to want to keep paying attention. Without that, a movie is just a random collection of scenes, and you don't have to study it a lot to be able to know the difference. The shortcut I used to use was to try to summarize the movie. If a movie has a working plot, there's a thing that draws everything together, and as a result, you can describe that movie in a page, a few paragraphs, or even less. In Avengers Infinity War, an all-powerful villain tries to destroy the entire universe, and the Avengers have to stop him. In Joker, a mentally disturbed comedian snaps at how the world treats him and becomes a weapon-toting maniac. You know there's certain words we can't say on YouTube now, and so on. When the movie doesn't have a plot, all you can do is just kind of vaguely list the scenes. An actor who's losing his fame tries to help out his stuntman friend, Charles Manson shows up, someone fights with Bruce Lee, Sharon Tate walks around, and so on. So the movie itself doesn't generate that feeling of interest while you're watching. And by the end of it, because the movie just danced around things instead of building around a major goal, it has a hard time paying you off. I think that you were supposed to be anticipating the Manson family attacking Sharon Tate, but the movie wasn't built around that either. You only see her and them in limited moments, and all the scenes with Rick just pull you away from that. If the movie had focused heavily on the Manson family and Sharon Tate, or if Rick and Cliff had hatched some very interesting plan to get him famous again as an actor, then we'd be onto something. But neither of those happen. However, even taking that into account, that those plot elements aren't there, it doesn't mean you don't want to watch. You can want to see how your favorite actor is going to perform. You might be waiting for some specific scenes with other actors, as I know a lot of people were here, and so on. So you don't actually feel the problem I'm talking about. It's only a major issue when the movie's plot doesn't work and you don't know or care about the filmmaker or actors. That's when people walk out of movies, which you can see sometimes at independent film festivals. But anyway, in the case of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the issue with the plot is not that there's no reason to watch. It's that the reason you have to watch is not nearly as strong as it could be. Because those things we described can actually go with a great plot. And in a great movie, one that has a huge impact on people, makes huge money, wins awards, lasts for years, and so on, that's what happens. The movie works not just in terms of the outside things, but in terms of the inside things, the actual plot being well executed as well. So let's take a look at Pulp Fiction. Pulp Fiction has separate stories, but each one has a defined plot. Two hitmen recover a mysterious briefcase. One of them goes on a date with his boss's wife and tries to save her from dying. A boxer refuses to throw a fight and runs away from a mob boss, and so on. And the movie's long enough that each one is able to play out. You could describe the individual scenes in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood that way, but they don't have that amount of time and they're actually not compelling. But anyway, with Pulp Fiction, it's not just that. You can also watch Pulp Fiction to appreciate John Travolta's comeback, to anticipate things you've heard about in the movie, and so on. It actually works in both ways, and the result is a much greater amount of feeling for people who watch it. And we can move on to another part of it, not just looking at the plot itself or which actors you're watching, but looking at things we know in the real world. And this is where we get a huge difference. Because besides all those parts of the plot that you can enjoy watching, you can also know about Quentin Tarantino himself. At the time, Quentin Tarantino was the hero of his own story. Pulp Fiction changed Hollywood, and what people thought movies could do. Quentin Tarantino was a video store clerk who got where he was because of his own talent, something a lot of people love to hear about and want to believe is possible. All of these are compelling and well-formed stories of their own, which, by the way, you can describe quickly. So anyway, when you take all these into account, people didn't just pay attention to what he was doing and where he was going with the movie while they were watching it. It was also confirming things they wanted to be true in their own lives and showing them new ways of doing things and presenting a new talented person that they want to learn about and follow. For a lot of people, it was their inspiration to want to make movies themselves. All of that was part of people's reaction to Pulp Fiction. Like we said, you have the story in the movie itself, the creator's story, and what it means in the story of the viewer's life. Pulp Fiction delivered in all three areas. And that's what you need to get people to feel enough about a movie to label it as a legendary film and remember it for their entire lives. By comparison, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood doesn't do nearly as much. For a lot of people, it was good to see Quentin Tarantino back. It was great to see Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio in scenes together. But these little bits of confirmation that the filmmakers and actors we've liked for a long time still matter, that bit of respect, is nowhere near as powerful as the wide-scale feelings we get from seeing the entire movie industry change from the work of one humble person, and the deep-scale feeling we get from seeing a video store clerk change their own entire life and become a famous and successful director, including the deep things it meant for many people watching. So between these two movies, made by the same director, we have two different emotional experiences that have two different levels of result. One lasts for decades, changes how people make movies, and is considered one of the greatest ever made. The other is fine, gets good reviews, and people move on from it in a few months. Both of these are understandable. The negative reactions we have from movies come when they create negative feelings in us, when there is something about the movie that is insulting, or when the movie doesn't give us what we felt we paid for. So a movie that doesn't feel confusing or arrogant or insulting will immediately avoid bad reviews, even if it doesn't do much else for the audience. But when you add to that the movie ticking off the major boxes, giving us something to pay attention to, some elements that give us a feeling of confirmation, our lives being a bit better, a few laughs, and so on, people will start to feel that the movie was good. But since the things that keep us watching, that give us the emotional payoffs, depend so much on things outside the plot, liking Tarantino and the actors and seeing what they're up to, we don't get the huge level of feeling that we can get when we have the outside things working and the plot of the movie itself working. It's something that we're actually trained to expect when we study great movies. They all come with that social momentum and the stories about the filmmakers, actors, making of the movie, and so on. The same is true for other types of art. And the greatest things of all time, in our minds, will combine all of that with some personal meaning too. And since Pulp Fiction was one of the major things that got me into writing, it fulfills all those goals for me, and I think of it as one of the best movies I've ever seen. It took me years to figure out all the parts of my own reaction and start to see what's actually going on with how we judge these things. I also spent years learning about how Pulp Fiction itself worked as a movie, which is probably a topic to touch on later. But for now, I hope this info sheds some light on things that aren't normally said when we review or discuss movies, and I'll be back soon.